8:18 a.m. In the unforgiving wind of Harbor Line Industrial Port, CEO Miranda Holt addressed the morning assembly. Ethan Ward, a 42-year-old single dad and senior mechanic, stood at the back. Miranda stopped the meeting, called Ethan's name loudly, her voice cutting like glass, and publicly read his protocol violation, a fabrication of her team. He was ordered to surrender his badge immediately. His 8-year-old daughter, Lily, watched the humiliation from the fence. Ethan quietly accepted the shaming. No one knew Navy Seahawk helicopters were already approaching from the sea. Ethan Ward was a man defined by efficiency and discipline. He rose hours before dawn for the port's earliest shift, the only way to ensure he could still manage the 8:30 a.m. drop-off at Lily's school. He was quiet, almost monastic, performing his complex mechanical work with the precision of a surgeon. His accuracy was legendary. His complaints, non-existent. He worked harder, spoke less, and never sought attention. For 2 decades, he had lived by a simple code. Competence is its own defense. The incident Miranda Holt had leveraged was a minor conveyor belt stoppage the week before. A brief interruption that cost the company negligible time but provided a powerful opportunity for leverage. The official accusation read, "Failure to follow the 2-person verification rule on the automated load balancer sequence." It was a critical but easily fixable procedural step. The investigation report Miranda held was paper-thin, lacking context or mitigating evidence. What Miranda ignored, and what her team failed to mention, was the chain of predictive emails Ethan had sent months ago, meticulously detailing the structural flaw in the maintenance process that caused the failure. He hadn't just warned about the conveyor belt. He had pointed out the systemic lack of redundancy and the single point of failure in the automated system's legacy code. Those warnings, ignored and buried under layers of bureaucracy, were now being spun into an intentional protocol violation. Miranda Holt, the CEO, was driven by optics and performance reports. Her persona was one of ruthless, decisive leadership. She viewed the workforce not as people, but as controllable variables in an equation of profit. With the recent quarter showing budget overruns, she needed a visible scapegoat, a loud public example to deter any further slip-ups. Ethan was the perfect silent target. His refusal to engage in office politics made him an easy sacrificial lamb. The punishment had to be total, a full public shaming, an event designed to install fear and compliance in the remaining workforce. The firing decision was delivered specifically in front of the assembled team. The integrity of Harbor Line is built on adherence to safety protocols. Miranda's voice rang out, cold and unyielding, the sound amplified by a cheap loudspeaker. Failure, especially negligent failure, cannot be tolerated. We must send a clear message. Mr. Ward, your service is terminated immediately. A palpable wave of tension swept through the crowd. This wasn't just a firing, it was a political execution. Ethan Ward, standing before her, remained a pillar of composure, his expression unreadable. He could have fought back, could have produced the paper trail of ignored warnings right then and there. But public confrontation was not his way, and exposing Miranda would only turn the moment into a useless, chaotic argument. He chose silent acceptance. He simply asked for a few minutes to collect his personal items, an appeal Miranda granted with a dismissive wave of her hand. As he walked toward his locker, he felt the heavy silence of betrayal. He glanced through the fence. Lily stood there, her small hand gripping the mesh. Her eyes were wide, taking in the spectacle of her father's humiliation. It was the hardest part. Ethan gave her a tiny, almost invisible nod, the military signal they shared. "I am fine. Everything is under control." It was the quietest lie he had ever told, designed to protect her from the sharp edges of adult injustice. The atmosphere among his coworkers was thick with conflicting emotions. They knew Ethan's competence. They knew the warnings he had issued. They met his gaze with a mixture of guilt and fear. But fear of Miranda was greater than loyalty. They avoided his gaze, turning their backs or staring down at the concrete. They were silent participants in his downfall. They simply let him fall. Ethan returned, carrying a small, worn box containing his tools and a framed photo of Lily, a tiny relic of the life he was fighting to maintain. He signed the termination document with a steady hand, his signature firm and unmistakable, even in defeat. It was an act of complete control, a final declaration that they could take his job, but not his dignity. Miranda, looking down at him from her position of power, delivered the final, crushing blow. Her words were a sentence. "You are done, Mr. Ward. Leave the premises now." He turned and walked toward the gate, the heavy cardboard box clutched in his hands. It held the detritus of a career, now reduced to a few essential tools. Lily darted forward as he reached the external gate. "Daddy, are we going home now?" she asked, her voice small and shaky, still processing the confusing scene of the big lady shouting and the men looking away. The humiliation was complete. Ethan Ward looked straight ahead, past the port entrance, past the silent condemnation of the management team, toward the vast, empty expanse of the sea. He knew what he had done. He had followed his conscience, and the price was this raw, public dismissal. He took a long, steadying breath. He knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that the story was not over. The sea was silent, but the silence felt like a prelude. Ethan settled Lily onto a bench at the small windswept bus stop just outside the main perimeter of the port. He placed his box of tools carefully between them, his posture still rigid despite the obvious strain of the morning. His immediate priority was protecting Lily from the immediate fallout. He pulled out his phone and called her school, his voice calm, explaining they would be late due to an unexpected schedule change. He offered no details of the firing, maintaining the facade of control. Inside, however, his mind was a battlefield. "It's not my problem now. They made their choice. I owe them nothing." The logical side of his brain argued for self-preservation, but the military man, the safety officer, fought back. Duty is not conditional. Lives are not conditional. He had spent years mitigating disaster. The potential chain reaction in tank cluster number 3 was a known, calculated threat, one he felt personally responsible for having failed to prevent months ago. A flurry of text messages momentarily illuminated his screen. They were short, nervous communiques from former colleagues. "Ethan, I'm sorry. I couldn't." "Man, that was harsh. Heads up, they're still mad. Watch your back." Then the messages ceased abruptly, a clear sign that management had issued a strict order against contact. Ethan deleted the threads, understanding the fear. He had been an inconvenience. Now he was a contaminant. Meanwhile, inside the port, the carefully maintained illusion of control was beginning to fracture. A junior foreman conducting a routine pressure check on the vast liquid fuel storage tanks noticed the first discrepancy. Tank cluster number 3, a massive critical reservoir that fed the entire terminal, was registering an anomalous pressure spike. It wasn't extreme, but it was out of the safety margin. Worse, the primary digital warning system, the very system Ethan had designed and meticulously maintained, flickered, then failed to sound the full alarm. The red light was intermittent, a nervous stutter instead of a commanding emergency signal. The engineers, already shaken by the public firing, huddled around the faulty gauge. They were paralyzed by analysis. "Is it an overpressurization from the refinery feed?" one asked. "No, the relief valve should have dumped by now," another countered, nervously consulting a manual. They were debating generalities, lost in the noise of the system failure. The culture of fear was now their greatest liability. No one dared to make the definitive call, fearing Miranda's wrath if they triggered a false alarm, or, worse, made the wrong diagnosis. They were specialists, but without a clear commander, they were rudderless. Miranda Holt, who had retreated to her air-conditioned office after the morning's execution, was suddenly back on the maintenance yard. She was on a furious, hushed phone call, her executive composure visibly fraying. The unexpected anomaly was escalating rapidly. A specialist engineer, sweating despite the cold wind, pointed out that the pressure spike was localized, a clear sign of a downstream obstruction, not a mainline surge. But the specific nature of the obstruction, the tertiary bypass valve, was too specialized for anyone present to confirm. Ethan glanced at his worn wristwatch. The time, 9:15 a.m. It was exactly within the predicted failure window he had outlined in his ignored email. the time frame when the internal structural fatigue coupled with external temperature shifts would create a critical stress point in the fuel line. He felt the cold realization that his warning was manifesting in real time. He knew the specific obscure component that was failing. He had been the one to insist it be replaced years ago. He hesitated for only a second, the ingrained habit of anonymity fighting the lifetime reflex of duty. He had been fired. It was no longer his problem. But the thought was instantly overridden by the image of Lily and the hundreds of other families who lived near the port. A detonation in tank cluster number 3 would be devastating, easily capable of leveling the entire industrial zone. He stood up, leaving Lily and his box of tools, and walked swiftly back towards the main entry gate. The armed security guard, a young man named Tom, stepped forward, blocking his path. "Mr. Ward, you know I can't let you in. You're no longer on the roster. Please, you need to leave the premises." Ethan didn't raise his voice, but his command presence was absolute. He spoke quickly, concisely, cutting through the guard's nervousness. "The pressure gauge on tank cluster number 3 is fluctuating. It's a failure of the tertiary bypass valve. That valve is failing to vent vapor buildup, which will cause an unvented pressure surge in less than 20 minutes. Get someone down there immediately." The guard stared blankly, unable to process the highly technical information. "Sir, I need a badge. I can't process that. It has to come from the office." Ethan repeated the single critical word, "Cluster 3." His eyes, normally placid, held a fierce, unblinking intensity that briefly unnerved the young guard. But hesitation won. The guard simply shook his head, looking anxiously toward his radio. Ethan's warning was ignored. His status as a protocol violator negated the truth of his words. He felt a soft tug on his hand. Lily had followed him to the gate. "They don't believe you, Dad," she whispered, her brow furrowed with disappointment. "But you were right." Ethan looked at the guard, his expression hardening. His moment of intervention was over. He had tried. Without access, without authority, he was useless. He couldn't afford to be arrested or drawn into a useless argument. He took Lily's hand, turned, and walked away from the industrial complex. He did not dispute the guard or Miranda or his fate. The dignity of competence had been dismissed. As they walked past the last stack of empty shipping containers, a sound began to register in the atmosphere, a deep, rhythmic thumping that vibrated low in the chest. It was not the sound of a cargo ship or a port vehicle. It was a heavy, unfamiliar sound, growing steadily louder, a sound of profound mechanical power approaching from the sea. Ethan paused, looking up, his military instincts suddenly screaming at him. The sky was still pale, but the horizon was no longer empty. If you want to find out why the military is looking for a man who was just fired, subscribe to continue reading. The sound intensified with terrifying speed, a heavy, unmistakable thwop, thwop, thwop of massive rotary blades. Two dark shapes, low on the horizon, rapidly became distinct. They were not commercial aircraft, but Navy MH-60 Seahawk helicopters, massive twin-engine machines built for heavy-duty marine operations in search and rescue. The airframe vibration, which had been low and distant, now rattled the windows of the port's main office block. The helicopters flew directly over the port, banking sharply before descending upon the main maintenance yard where Miranda Holt and her bewildered engineers were still arguing over the failing pressure gauge. The downdraft was immense, kicking up thick clouds of grit, dust, and debris. Papers flew, hats were ripped off, and the workers scattered, shouting, shielding their faces from the sudden, artificial gale. Miranda, her silk scarf whipping around her neck, stumbled backward in shock, her initial thought being a catastrophic military accident. The lead helicopter settled heavily onto the concrete pad, its engines still running at a powerful idle, its dark silhouette dominating the entire yard. The side hatch slid open instantly. A figure in full Navy flight gear, a lieutenant commander, jumped down, followed by a medic and a technical specialist. His face was masked by goggles, but his posture was all command, a stark contrast to the port's panicked chaos. This was the freeze moment, the instant where the world stopped, forcing everyone to confront the impossible truth. The lieutenant commander strode purposefully toward the frozen group of engineers and managers, moving with the speed and precision of someone on a life-or-death mission. He looked past Miranda, past the foreman, past the security guard at the gate. He shouted over the deafening roar of the rotors, his voice amplified by the urgency of the situation. "We are looking for Mr. Ethan Ward. Does anyone know the location of Mr. Ethan Ward?" Silence descended, not because the rotor stopped, but because the human mind could not reconcile the scene. The CEO, the public execution, the desperate engineers, all vanished beneath the shadow of the military presence. Miranda Holt slowly turned, her head whipping around, her terror-stricken eyes searching for the single father she had just cast out. The engineers simply pointed, numbly, toward the main gate where Ethan had walked away moments before. The lieutenant commander immediately presented his identification to the nearest manager, a gesture of formality in the face of profound emergency. The identification confirmed his status. U.S. Navy, Rapid Response, Naval Operational Safety. The officer spoke, the reality of the situation cutting through the noise. "Mr. Ward is urgently required. He is a former commander and tactical safety officer for the Naval Operational Readiness Command. He was responsible for the strategic safety framework of this entire sector before his retirement 4 years ago. His expertise is crucial." The shock was total. Ethan Ward was not just a senior mechanic. He was an elite operator, a high-ranking officer whose civilian job was a deliberate step down to prioritize his daughter. He had submitted a high-priority risk assessment to the command chain regarding the structural integrity and maintenance of specific liquid fuel containment procedures at this terminal. "We received his predictive failure timeline and code analysis. We believe the failure he warned about, the exact one, is imminent. The fuel in Cluster 3 is unstable and needs immediate intervention." The email Miranda had ignored, the document she had used to brand him a protocol violator, had been flagged by the military intelligence community as a critical national security risk and was routed immediately up the chain of command. They hadn't dismissed his warning. They had simply been too slow to mobilize. The Navy had come for the man they had just humiliated. Miranda stood petrified, a statue carved of disbelief and dread. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. The man she had ridiculed as a simple, inadequate mechanic was, in fact, the only person in the entire port with the specific knowledge to save the multi-billion-dollar facility and potentially the surrounding city from a massive explosion. From outside the fence, Ethan heard his name and the precise military language of the lieutenant commander. He walked back, this time not with a box of tools, but with the controlled stride of an officer answering a call to duty. Lily held his hand, now looking up at the massive helicopters, not with fear, but with an almost fierce pride. Ethan approached the lieutenant commander. They didn't shake hands. They looked at each other, one a commanding officer, the other a former one, united by the language of crisis. Ethan's first and only question was surgical, bypassing all the chaos and fear. He pointed directly at the trembling pressure gauge. "What is the pressure reading on the tertiary bypass valve for tank cluster number 3? Has anyone verified the manual override line is clear?" The specialist engineer, stunned by the sheer confidence, stammered the reading. Ethan closed his eyes for a split second, processing the numbers, a lifetime of tactical data analysis taking place in silence. "It is not a simple valve failure. It is a catastrophic pressure delta caused by a microfracture in the mainline manifold near the secondary thermal insulation layer," Ethan commanded, his voice suddenly loud, clear, and absolute, cutting through the rotor wash. "The bypass valve is only a symptom. The system is reading too little pressure at the sensor, creating a ghost surge. The only fix is a full, rapid depressurization via the manual bleed-off valve, the one on the lower west quadrant. It's the only one that hasn't been corrupted by the digital system failure. It must be done manually, immediately. Now! Move!" The engineer, despite Miranda's presence, snapped into action. They followed Ethan's exact, specific directions, their fear of the CEO instantly replaced by the fear of the impending disaster. Within minutes, the physical sound of venting pressure, a loud, controlled hiss, replaced the intermittent stutter of the dying alarm. The threat was controlled. The port was safe. The lieutenant commander stepped back from the tank, visibly relieved. He turned to Ethan Ward, standing tall in his civilian jacket. He removed his goggles and gave Ethan a sharp, precise military salute. The honor was total, public, and undeniable. The crisis was averted. The Navy lieutenant commander had his brief final conversation with the captain of the Harbor Line security team, securing the necessary documents and verification for the immediate threat mitigation. The heavy rotors slowed to a throbbing idle, preparing for departure. Miranda Holt, still shaken, finally found her voice. She walked to the center of the yard, addressing the entire group, the engineers, the maintenance workers, and the single father she had just disgraced. Her voice was raw, stripped of its former coldness. "Everyone, listen to me," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Mr. Ward saved this port. He saved our careers and potentially saved countless lives in this city. I publicly accused him of negligence this morning." She paused, forcing the confession out. "I publicly admit that I was the negligent party. I ignored his warnings. I created an environment where safety was secondary to performance reviews, and I apologize." She turned directly to Ethan, standing next to his daughter. "Mr. Ward, I am immediately reinstating your position and offering you a promotion to Chief of Safety Operations. You will report only to me, effective immediately." Ethan shook his head, a gesture of quiet refusal. The public spotlight was now on him, but he did not crave the power. "Ms. Holt," he said calmly, his voice carrying the authority of the man who had just saved her company, "I appreciate the offer, but I cannot accept an internal position. My responsibility is to my daughter now. I will offer Harbor Line a contract as an independent external safety consultant for a fixed term." Miranda was taken aback, but her humiliation was too profound to argue. "What are your terms?" "Two conditions," Ethan stated. His conditions aimed not at money, but at dignity. "First, every safety and risk assessment email must be read, acknowledged, and addressed within 24 hours, regardless of the sender's rank. It must be a clear, auditable process. Second, the policy of public shaming and firing for minor, non-malicious errors is abolished. You build trust, Mrs. Holt, not fear." Miranda looked at the silent faces of her workers. She knew she had no choice. "Accepted." The engineers and workers, who had stood in silent fear for years, suddenly erupted into applause, a deafening, overwhelming ovation. It was not just for the crisis averted, but for the quiet father who had refused to capitalize on his rescue, choosing instead to protect them from the toxic culture. For the first time, they stood openly on Ethan's side. Lily, eyes shining, looked up at her father. She didn't fully understand the technical details, but she understood the respect. She saw the pride and the honor in the strong lines of his face. The lieutenant commander approached Ethan one last time, nodding. "Commander, your integrity is intact. We'll be in touch." He and his team quickly reboarded the aircraft. The two massive Navy helicopters lifted off, turning back toward the sea, the roar slowly receding. The wind died down, and the sun broke through the remaining dust. Miranda stood there, a powerful CEO brought to her knees by a single man's quiet truth. She gave Ethan a deep, genuinely humble bow. Ethan watched her, then looked down at his daughter. He took Lily's small hand in his, a final, soft exhalation of breath leaving his lungs. The battle was over. The Harbor Line industrial port resumed safe operation within the week, but everything had shifted. The culture of fear was replaced by a guarded, professional respect. Ethan Ward began his work as an independent safety consultant, appearing exactly when his services were required, commanding triple the rate he had before. He maintained his schedule strictly, ensuring he was always on time to pick up Lily from school. His independence was his shield. He had traded a job for a true role. Lily, however, was no longer quiet. She now spoke about the port with an infectious, confident pride. "My dad saved the whole port," she told her teacher and classmates during show and tell. Ethan, hearing the story later, would simply smile. "I didn't save the port, sweetie. I just listened carefully to what the machines were saying. Everyone has a role to play. Mine is just knowing when to speak up." Miranda Holt had changed too. The fear of failure that drove her ruthlessness had been replaced by the fear of ignorance. The two conditions Ethan had set were not only followed, but implemented rigorously. Safety reports and risk assessments were now read, prioritized, and personally acknowledged by senior management. The email that saved the port became legendary, the symbol of a system that finally learned to listen. Ethan required no title to command respect. His presence alone was the new safety metric. He was no longer a commodity, he was a standard. He was the constant reminder that the most valuable asset in the company was the knowledge of the person doing the work, not the title on their door. One afternoon, a former foreman approached Ethan as he was packing his mobile workstation. The foreman, the same man who had turned his back during the firing, stammered out a choked apology. "Ethan, I should have stood up for you that day. I'm sorry." Ethan simply extended his hand, his grip firm and warm. "We're here now," he said, the past dismissed without bitterness. "The most important thing is that everyone gets to go home safely." The sun began to dip low over the harbor, painting the massive cranes in hues of orange and deep purple. It was the end of Ethan's shift. He met Lily at the gate. She took his hand, clutching her backpack. They walked together, shoulder to shoulder, across the concrete and out into the public world. Ethan's back was straight, his shoulders square. The posture of the commander, the posture of the single father who stood up for what was right. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, leave a comment and subscribe to Single Dad Stories.